Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I want to thank you for having a hearing to address a problem that affects not just South Mississippi, but 53% of all Americans. And according to NOAA, 53% of all Americans live in a coastal community. In 17 states from the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic coast, the insurance industry on a state-by-state basis is pulling out. My own experience in South Mississippi is that despite the efforts of South Mississippians to board up their homes, to protect their goods, thousands of people lost everything they owned the night of Hurricane Katrina. That was the first tragedy. Second tragedy was within days of the storm, people were told that because there was wind and water that occurred, that although they had bought all the insurance that was available to them in both a wind policy and a flood policy, they were denied wind coverage. In fact, it seems the only people who were paid their wind claims in the beginning were people who were eyewitnesses to the devastation of the storm. So, Madam Chairman, what I ask you to do is, in response to the fact that the insurance industry apparently no longer wants to cover people for wind damage in coastal America or will not provide that coverage at a cost that is reasonable, is to consider legislation that would expand the National Flood Insurance Program to include all natural perils. Under the rules of this House, it would have to be done in a way that pays for itself. Thus, any argument that this would be taxpayer subsidized would be eliminated, because under the new rules of the House, that is not an option. But it does affect thousands of people. And quite frankly, people should be encouraged to get out of coastal areas in the time of a storm rather than encouraged to stick behind with a camera to record the event. In my state, thousands of people have had to resort to hiring a lawyer, having to resort to hire engineers, having to resort to go to court. In fact, about the only people who have gotten justice were the eyewitnesses or the people who hired high-profile lawyers to settle their claims. That really shouldn't be the case. And in the case of the flood insurance program, we allow the private sector to write that policy, but we also allow them to adjudicate the claim. So as companies are issuing internal documents that tell their employees to blame everything on the water and pay the flood claim immediately, that flies in the face of their contractual obligation to our nation to a fair adjudication of claim. So the present system isn't working. And it's not working for individuals who were affected by the storm, and it's not working for our nation's taxpayers who paid the difference. I would remind my colleagues that in the same year that the insurance industry had $45 billion in profits, the National Flood Insurance Program lost $20 billion. It doesn't have to be that way. Our nation stepped forward in the late 1960s to come up with the National Flood Insurance Program. There was a need that the private sector chose not to fill, and our nation wisely filled that need. I think it's time for our nation to step forward once again for a need that needs to be filled that the private sector, for whatever reason, is choosing not to fill. And that is for all perils catastrophic insurance, so whether it's a tornado in Alabama, an earthquake in California, a fire in the Pacific Northwest, as long as a person has built their home to the proper standards, as long as they have paid their premiums, as long as we can devise a program that is done in a way that pays for itself, people of America ought to be protected. Because in South Mississippi right now, there's a common occurrence for people who had $3,000, $4,000, and $5,000 square foot houses to be replacing them with $1,000 square foot houses. First, because they weren't paid their claim from the last storm, and now they're being told if you do rebuild, you're going to pay 4, 5, or 6 times more for insurance than you did before. And quite frankly, no one I know wants to pay more on an insurance note than they want to pay in a house note. And it just stands to reason that we've got to do better. We've got to do better as far as building codes. We've got to do better as far as the national flood elevation maps, which were so grossly inadequate. And there is a nation's interest in doing this for the 53% of all Americans who live in coastal America. So, Madam Chairman, we've had many opportunities to speak about this. This is the first time to actually offer a piece of legislation, and so I would very much request that at your convenience some sort of a markup be held on HR, I believe it's 94, with the opportunity to make the case for that as a standalone measure. I welcome to what my colleagues from Florida have to say today. I don't believe reinsurance is the answer, but I am pleased to see such a large delegation recognizing the problem does exist, and that exists not just for them, for Mississippi, for South Carolina and Alabama, but for 53% of all Americans who live in a coastal community and who are looking for their nation for some help.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor.